Hello, and welcome to the Hunter Bond podcast, where I get the opportunity to speak to some of the leaders and key players within the world of finance, technology, and recruitment. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Vijay Venkatesh. Vijay has an extensive background in engineering with a computer science degree from Boston University. He spent the past 15 years in a management capacity and the last 10 years in executive level positions, acting as CTO in both large prestigious businesses as well as emerging tech startups in the US. So firstly, Vijay, thank you for joining us, and how are you doing? You okay?
Thank you so much for having me. Enjoying the New York summer as it kicked off yesterday.
Oh, really? No, nice. We've had the last couple of weeks, but it's been roasting hot, and then we've swiftly got back into the typical English weather. So it's been wet and cold for the past few days. It just doesn't decide to make its mind up. But I know your weather is very cold in the winter, isn't it? And then very hot in the summer. So you get kind of polars on both sides, don't you?
Yeah, not as dramatic as UK London weather, but just brutal on either end. So
Fair enough. Well, firstly, as I say, thank you for joining us. I think there's a lot great things to talk about today. I think your engineering background and I guess making the transition from I guess being on the ground engineering software development work and then transitioning into kind of like a managerial position, how you kind of make that transition, but also you've had the opportunity to work in both manager and exec level positions in both larger businesses and as well as sort of emerging startups. And I think there's probably a lot of differences there. And I think a lot of people can take a lot of value out of, I guess, the experiences you had, maybe sort of trapdoors and things you can help to, I guess, people can identify when looking to make that transition themselves. But firstly, just to go in, I guess, a little bit more about your background and your I guess your career history. If you could tell the people a little bit more about yourself, I guess.
Absolutely. So, computer science engineering, it's really what I think I first knew I was, semi good at or not entirely bad at. And my first device or computer was something called a BBC microcomputer, which had the, sort of black and red keyboard and, a screen, and the input device was a tape, for things like games and other applications. And then eventually it was, Visual Basic and other things. But so that's kind of where I got started, really sort of on the games and kind of basic programming, ASCII only kind of input. From that point on, I think, started taking, programming classes, and kind of that trend, I think, kept following me all the way through college, where I first came to the States, computer science undergrad, and then, graduate degree as well. And then worked in companies of different sizes. So everything from, small startup, sort of a consulting, systems integrator, large company, but, small tech team within a large company, a company called Pearson, which is, very well known worldwide for its focus on education and learning and previously also media and content. And so, it's really been a journey through companies of different sizes, different domains. Education has been a big part of my career, sort of technology within education, or ed tech as it's sometimes called. And then, startups of different domains, everything from e-commerce, hardware, software companies. More recently, on the consumer end, bringing convenience to storage, dealing with logistics. So just teams of different sizes, domains, solving different problems, very different technologies as a result. And it's kind of learning what works and what doesn't work, at different places. And so that's kind of been my journey to date.
Oh, brilliant. And so I think what I really wanted to sort of touch on, I guess, was that transition you made from, hands-on engineering role into more of a management position. How did that happen?
It's a great question. I mean, I think to some extent, I think it's probably still happening in the sense that, I'm still figuring out what is the right balance of, how close to be with the technology, with code, with engineering, with, operational challenges, architectural challenges, and helping drive solutions with, being further moved, taking a few steps back, a bit more strategic, and you're looking at longer term outcomes. But the first time that transition happened was, I was an engineer, senior person on our team had left. He was who everyone reported to. There was a new CTO, and so there needed to be, this is at Pearson, there needed to be a new leader or a new manager for the team. And I think a few people were, interviewed, and I got tapped to play that role. So I think nothing quite prepared me for what that means or what that doesn't mean, and how I should approach it, same or differently. And I think I made the mistake, which didn't dawn on me until probably 2 or 3 years later. But I think I made the mistake of approaching it the same as I had been doing. In other words, this is the same role that I did on Friday, except on Monday I'm now an engineering man. I think that's
You got a new business card, but yeah.
Yeah, sorry, you got the new business card. You're still in the same seat, but I think that's like a tactical mistake, because you really miss out on how to be more effective, how to lead teams. Not to mention, I think when you're previously a group of friends, all working together, and now sort of you're leading and managing the team, there's also that sort of interpersonal dynamic as well.
Interesting. So was there, I mean, I know a few people obviously went for that role. What sort of skills do you think stood out initially? Why do you think you were selected maybe over others? What do you think they identified in you to think that you was the appropriate person for that role?
To be honest, I'm not sure. Maybe it was just like a breadth of experience. I'd worked in 3 or 4 different platforms at the time. There's learning platforms, integration. There was a few things. So it could have been that. But I think once I was in the role, I think the ownership sort of expanded quite quickly, because then there was an authentication and identity management and single sign-on application. There was integrations. There were other systems that kind of quickly came within scope. There was a bunch of hiring. Wow. To touch on one of your other topics, we had some interesting sort of system-wide or application-wide challenges, which I won't go into too much depth on, but that kind of prompted a bit of soul searching for the company. So we kind of embraced Agile as a company, and everyone got trained top to bottom. So I think it was a very pivotal moment, because I think it taught me a lot of how to approach management, what to do, what not to do. So I think some of the trapdoors are things like I said, approaching the new role the same as you did your previous role, which is almost never the case. But the other mistake also, I think, is going to the other extreme, which is completely dropping everything you used to do and just walking the floor things. You don't want to be on either extreme of that. And so I think where that first dawned on me, I think, was like I said, 2-3 years later, where like I was just doing the role and just I was busier, because now we had to create a QA function and an automation function, and we had a whole host of other things that I was taking on. But I think where it first dawned on me was that we were in, I think, some kind of meeting or review, looking at progress against forecast or things like that. And a lot of the systems that I owned were all behind schedule, and it wasn't because of effort. It wasn't because of sort of lack of focus or anything like that. But I think people sort of looked around and said, well, we had like X head count open at the start of the year, and we filled like X divided by 2 or something less than that. And so I think everyone sort of looked at me as like, well, you're a bit of a roadblock, because you haven't kept up with your hiring targets or your growth targets and your team leadership. And so that's when I kind of think it first really dawned on me, is that it's enough to be or try to be the deepest technical mind in the room, and sort of know all the systems and know all of the interconnected intricacies and everything else. But you really have to like ultimately figure out where the team needs to be and how they need to grow. So I think those were some sort of pivotal moments, especially kind of being called out in public. I think really kind of helped me think, okay, I've got to approach this differently. I have to think about this differently. Exactly.
Yeah, you're right. So yes, being as close to technology is obviously vital and important. But as you say, being close to the business and the needs of the team, and understanding, the business metric side of things as well is obviously sounds very important along that as well. You mentioned trapdoors as well. So, I think hopefully, I'm sure there's a lot of people that are going to be watching this who are engineers who have, ambitions to become leaders and move into that. Is there anything else, I guess, they should kind of be aware of, or what could they do to prepare themselves for that kind of transition?
It's a great question. I think right now, I think there are a lot more resources than there were about 15 years ago. Right. Like when I first became an engineering manager, I think there's all kinds of early manager training within technical and sort of product context, and not kind of generic management, but focused in our space. So I think those resources are absolutely worth tapping into. There's I'm not sure this is at the more junior manager levels, but there may be. There are peer groups, there are mentorship opportunities where there are companies that you can work with that will pair you with external more senior or like-minded, like-leveled resources and people from other companies, where you can have the benefit of anonymity, and you have the ability to just kind of vent slash brainstorm how they might approach certain things. I think all of these things are things that unfortunately didn't exist when I was getting into management. But I think other trapdoors are, right now I think a lot of the advice tends to be very binary and very black or white in terms of either you have to be doing your old job and coding sort of day in, day out, or you shouldn't do any of it and just, not touch it. And I think either extreme, like I say, is probably not worthwhile. So I think there's maybe like a few ways you can maybe split the difference. I think one, you have to, ultimately you are responsible for the team and their output and the team's quality and the quality of their output and so on. So I think to be completely divorced from what is produced, how it is being reviewed, how it is, being integrated, merged, how often it's, I think those are things that you have to completely be on top of. You have to, in my case, even as CTO, is like, probably a few times weekly, but you have to, keep your environment as up to date, your development environment, as the rest of your team. So, if you see, a couple of, bugs kind of floating by, maybe you can sign up for some of those if there's some kind of pull, Kanban like pull or Scrum like system. And so you still have the ability to, add like simple bug fixes, not like major things, because your time probably will be limited, but basic bugs that are such and such user and this kind of state couldn't get logged in, and it's a simple sort of profile kind of thing, or things of that nature. And so I think that's probably one way to kind of split the difference. Is another way, I think, is if that's not feasible, which sometimes it may not be. I think if the team is beyond 7-8 people, I think the other is to code in your free time. So it could be on the weekends, it could be at night, various projects. It could be setting up a blog in a new technology. There's lots of new sort of static serving blog technologies out there that will teach you a lot about, for example, Go or React or other things as well. So there's new technologies. I think other trapdoors are kind of coming back to the team, and I think two more that I can think of. I think one is really understanding that your success is the team's success, and the team's success is your success. I think I still see a lot of, and I see this more in, this may be different, country to country, but there's a notion of a tech lead, which sometimes I see as a title, sometimes I see as a role, sometimes I see as a function. So it sort of changes company to company. But in any case, there's a notion that there's someone who is a technical authority or is leading an initiative or maybe a few initiatives for a sprint team over some period of time. Sometimes people make it formal and they make it a title, but I think it's more of a function or a role, not a specific title. In any case, I think sometimes when tech leads switch into management, I think they haven't quite left their former self behind, and they still view it as, well, the way to be the tech lead is to be the sharpest technical mind in the room and know all the things, and so you kind of carry that mindset into management, and then it backfires, because now you have to know where to give and take. You have to know where to support the team. So I think that's a very big trapdoor. I've seen people struggle with that. And I think lastly, kind of knowing about the team's success, is really investing in the team is one thing I always suggest every engineering manager should know is you have to be able to answer the question, why is each person on your team here? Where here is, the company or firm that you're at, and be able to answer that at some detail. So, where were they? Why did they join? What motivated them to join?
Yeah.
What about the domain interests them? What does it mean for their career? What are they looking to get from this experience? What are they looking to take away? Because no one's going to be with a company forever. So this time, this period in time means something to them, and it's your duty as a manager to really sort of unearth that and really kind of figure out, well, how do I sort of match what I'm able to provide, the environment and the resources I have at my disposal with what this individual cares about, and kind of if you can make that happen, you have a great happy marriage. So those are like 4 or 5 the trapdoors that sort of come to.
Yeah, that last point is very important. I think you've got to know how to get the best out of your team, and how you're going to do that is by motivating your team and understanding what are their motivations, and then setting up that kind of environment to really get them to perform to the best of their ability, and really actually be, especially I think when you're talking about startups where, I think, people have to be very committed. They have to, maybe go above and beyond. How are you going to get people to put in that extra time and extra effort to really help the startup grow? But I mean, one thing you touched on as well, I think, was not always necessarily needing to be the smartest person in the room and making every decision as a leader. How do you approach it in terms of your tech team, in terms of deciding on what technology to use or what direction to take? How do you deal with, I guess, difference in opinion in that kind of circumstance? Do you have to kind of take the authority on things, or is it very collaborative in the way that you manage things?
Right. I think it's probably something like the 80-20 or the Pareto, however you say it, principle, where I think about 80% of the time you really want to have the team sort of lead, and I think in those cases, your responsibility is to really make sure that you ask a lot of sort of first principle type questions. It's like, who is the customer here? What is intended? What is the problem we're solving? What is the customer experience? Really sort of basic foundational questions, and really to make sure that the team has either considered that and evaluated that in their thought process, and if not, that they will sort of encounter that in their designs or recommendations or proposals or whatever is being discussed. So I think that's one. And I think 20% of the time, the reason I say it's never like 100% the team, because I think it's a simple thing. If I think one of the roles of the leader ultimately is to figure out where the team needs to be, and so I'm also of the belief that soccer or football sort of explains most leadership challenges and problems, and so ultimately I think that
I use would be football most of the time.
That's right. You never want to be sort of Alex Ferguson or Sir Alex Ferguson throwing shoes at people's heads, but like I think it's where does a team need to be? What is the next level goal? What is the next level sort of outcome, or in some reasonable period of time? And so there's always going to be 20% of things. It might be technologies that you think the team should adopt, or it might be part of a technology vision. It might be sort of investing in infrastructure or investing in, CI/CD tools. It might be, whatever the specific use case is. I think it's really important that you have that ability. So that's where you have to invest time in, staying up to date, seeing what's out there, attending events, trying things, just sometimes taking a server and seeing if such and such tool works, or if logging or alerting, all kinds of tools. But I think having a perspective sometimes on some of those things, not on everything, but on maybe a few things that you can focus on, and where you think the team should head toward, I think is really important. So some kind of balance like that is, again, it might be different. Sometimes if it's a early stage company, it might be more 50-50, or if it's later stage, it might be 90-10. But there's always a balance where you're setting a direction, and I think the team has to sort of embrace and buy into that. Other cases where you're really sort of trying to make sure that the right questions have been unearthed and they are considering them and moving towards a reasonable outcome, some kind of balance.
The right decision. That makes sense. Yeah. And you also touched on as well, I guess, the importance of a CTO or a manager to still keep very up to date with emerging tech and what the difference is. It's not as simple to become just a great leader and then maybe forget about keeping your fingers on the pulse of technology, but also, I guess, keeping up to date and refreshing yourself, looking into new tech is really important as well, is it?
100%. The previous company I was at, their I don't know, motto or sort of tagline was always learning. And so I think that's how you have to approach it as a leader as well, because you're either learning new tech, or you're learning about management, or you're learning about agile principles, or you're learning about new ways to do, for example, incident management or postmortems, all kinds of things. Like, these are changing almost yearly or, semi-yearly or more frequently at the moment. So I think these are things that you absolutely have to have, a perspective on. So I think that's where, like I said, when I talk about kind of being hands-on, quote unquote, and what that means, that might be a place where either, you carve out time of the week, and it's difficult, and, you have to set your foot down and say, like, this is like the time that you have to kind of invest. It could be an hour, it could be 2 hours, sometime during the week, and then, or over the weekend, where, it could be something as simple as like a MOOC on a Coursera or Udemy or one of these resources, or a Pluralist, like, whatever you like, something to kind of learn some new technology. I do that all the time. Or in other cases, it could be just some tutorials that you could like learn from the web, 2 hours, and you kind of have a concept of how something works and something gets deployed. Or I think those are really important, because otherwise, I'll tell you the reason it's important. One thing I sometimes get asked, even as a leader, is, are you like tech focused, or are you people focused? And sometimes the reason for that is not what you might think. It's actually counterintuitive. Sometimes people want leaders who are purely people focused, and I don't think they realize how much of a trapdoor, or how much of a short-sightedness that is, because in those cases, where, like, let's say you have a bunch of incidents, or you have a bunch of delays, and often those have technical roots. They have either debt, they have bad architecture, they have some kind of operational limitation. If you don't have a perspective on those things, if you're, say, hopefully not a CTO, but if you're like a director of engineering or a VP of engineering or a manager, if you approach it purely from a people lens, then your choices are limited, right? Either people don't understand their technology, or they're not motivated, or they're not working hard enough. But actually, if your tests take 3 hours to run, then no matter what they do, they can't release more than X amount of times in a day or a week, or what have you. And so, I think that's where the question itself, like, are you like a people leader or a technical leader, is, so what you want is people who are both, and can seamlessly sort of migrate their mindset from one to the other, in the way that a midfielder can. Like, you should be able to sort of attack, and you should be able to push forward in some cases, but 6 to 7 times out of 10, you're making sure a goal isn't scored against you. And so I think that's how leaders should really sort of evaluate themselves, and keep skills current at all times.
Yeah, definitely. I can imagine that in a startup where I think you have to wear lots of hats, but in say like a larger organization, for instance, where the tech team's a lot bigger, can you get individual people doing individual jobs? So someone maybe who is more on the leadership side of the tech side of thing, but someone who's very business orientated and people management, maybe not necessarily techie. Can you split them responsibilities and still work productively?
I think to a certain extent, yes. I was always told about one of my former CEOs would tell me about his former managers that they would still lead 300-400 person organizations, but still be writing their own and their own business intelligence reports, or trends and forecasting and things like that. So, I think it probably changes at different scales. But yes, you're right. I think as the team grows, there's definitely a lot more delegation. Not to mention you have resources with which to delegate. I think there's a constraint that is removed. But having said that, I think the flip side also is that at those larger companies, you also have better resources with which to learn, with which to invest. And so, if anything, you have more resources to learn about skills that have changed, or technologies that have changed, and you probably don't have to pay for it out of pocket. And so I think there's all an excuse even at a larger company, because ultimately, when you think about these sorts of leadership roles, there's the people, process, technology, and sort of business, which I sometimes hate that word, but roughly what I mean. And so I think those are like 4 quadrants, and you probably want those to sort of ebb and flow at different points in time, but never sort of take one as his hero. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. So it might be okay to be more business focused because you're trying to enter a new market, or you're trying to do a bunch of partnerships or, what have you. And so maybe you have to sort of delegate heavy on the other three quadrants. But I think the point I'm trying to make is, in these sorts of roles, you never want to be purely like the people and process person, because I think, I mean, the teams love, brainstorming with people who like will have insightful opinions or questions and perspectives on things, and who've seen either similar or bigger in previous companies. So I think that's something where I found those comments.
I think again, if we go back to the football analogy again, if you have a manager who's never played the game before, you're gonna be more responsive to someone who's been there and done it, and who can actually, when it comes to coaching and whatnot. So a lot of football analogies. But with regards to, I guess, the difference in startups and larger business in a leadership type of capacity, if someone was, I guess, choosing between the two, what would you say are the major differences, and what should people be looking out for?
Great question. I also think this one has a bit of a difference, country to country as well. So, for example, when I was in London, what I saw at a lot of the leadership sort of CTO, first of all, sometimes these roles would also be classified as, IT. So I think right there, that's like your first clue that, there's a bit of a difference in how like tech is viewed. But so I think that's the first thing. I think second thing is, I think in the larger companies, at some point, so I think a few things. The larger companies definitely have, because of the name, you obviously have a larger team and a larger presence, and you have a lot more people to sort of watch out for. So your role is a lot more sort of, rather than maybe technical architecture, people architecture, sort of organizational architecture, and looking at, you don't have to measure it, but like looking at maturity and kind of where do you have to head to next, and what's career management becomes really important. Sort of working with HR and the people side becomes really important. So I think those kinds of things change. There's probably more emphasis on things like maybe perhaps M&A and sort of acquisitions and integrations and things like that, or just larger scale partnerships and integrations. So like it does change the focus a little bit.
Yeah,
and I think sometimes a company has to decide, is it a company that sort of innovates from within, or innovate by acquisition? And certainly when I was at Pearson, a lot of the focus was on sort of innovation by acquisition, and so that changed to some extent how the internal team focused. But I think other changes are sometimes the speed, although I didn't necessarily see that when I was at a larger company. But I think with startups, I think there are fewer rules, there are fewer sort of limitations, fewer constraints. So if prior to say last year, if you wanted to hire someone who is remote, you just would do that and kind of move on. But maybe sometimes in a larger company, you have to make sure that HR and sort of policy, sort of sign off and everything. But so I think, those are, policies. I think the other thing is, with the startup, like I think, tooling becomes really important, I guess, especially if it's, observability, error management, logging, those kinds of tools. It's plunk the credit card down, sign up, and you're sort of up and running in like a day or half a day or less. I think in the larger companies, you can do that. But typically like there's some sign off somewhere, and sometimes the CIO has sort of kept a corporate standard of, well, you have to use such and such tool, but that's probably like a 2 or 3 year dated recommendation. And so exactly. So the other thing I think I see is the IT and business facing tech teams. Sometimes there's a potential for conflict in the larger companies for those reasons. Like thou shall not use such and such provider, or like even though they may be the best in the industry. And so things like that are where like conflict happens. Whereas a startup, if it's a great tool, you're signed up and you're up and running. So I think life on that side is a lot easier for a CTO or a VP of engineering with the startups. On the flip side, I think just to argue against myself for a second, I always was of the belief that it's really beneficial to work at a larger company first, and then start working for startups.
Okay.
Because I think you learn how to do things at scale. You have the ability to train and invest in people. You have the ability to, for example, set a base. We're going to do OKR training or OKR management, and sort of setting up objectives. Here's how we're going to do agile. Here's what it means for us. And you can invest in those kinds of things. Whereas at a startup, you have 10 people joining from 10 different things. So it takes a while for that kind of uniformity to set in, because you have very different perspectives. Not everyone does agile the same way. Some people don't know what Kanban is, or they've only done sprints. And so you kind of get all these, not to mention a lot of problems that they're seeing at scale, they're seeing for the first time. Whereas at a larger company, you've seen those problems at scale a bunch of times. So I think early in your career is really beneficial to work for like a larger company, either tech or tech-enabled or non-tech. And then kind of really apply those to startups as you kind of grow and mature.
That's great advice. I think that's great advice. To, as you say, especially with the scaling issues, and I think a lot of people can learn from that. There's a lot more training, development resources available so that you can transition into a startup a lot easier. I think you touched on metrics as well. I'd love to talk a little bit more about, I guess, business metrics, and as a leader being able to, I guess, the importance of evaluating company metrics and what you can take from that. So what's your thoughts, I guess, in terms of the importance of metrics and as a leader identifying these things?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way I think of metrics, really is a sort of hierarchical, level upon level of metrics. I think there's and at the very raw level, I think there's like code related metrics, code quality, things like that. It could be all the sort of DORA or DevOps type metrics, deployment frequency, things like that. Step above that, you can have the team level metrics, things like velocity, things like predictability, things like healthy deployments, things like that. Bugs found in production, and things of that nature, service level objectives, things like that. And I think a step up from that, I think, is really where you have like product metrics. So what does engagement look like? MAUs or some other kind of active user metric. Then you have things like some folks track like time spent. Some folks track again, that's business specific. But if you have a product, and this becomes really important, because then you have the ability to make hard decisions. If you have a product, and all the underlying metrics, like at the individual level, at the team level, at the sort of agile product level, are people have been cranking on things, but when it comes to the product level, you see that that thing is not being used, or it's barely being adopted. Then I think you have the ability to either get product marketing or someone else involved to say like, hey, why isn't this being? Could be a product manager, could be customer success, could be something to say like, hey, this is like a huge investment, and like there needs to be an accountability the other way. It's really, I think, tech or product going to the business folks and saying like, hey, this is like 2 months worth of like collective team effort. Like, this is a huge investment. We don't see any uptake in this at all.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where you kind of have the product metrics. And I think ultimately a step up from that is how the business itself performs. That's like your monthly recurring revenue, annual recurring revenue. What does LTV, lifetime value, look like? What does CAC, customer acquisition costs, look like? The very common or popular metric is the LTV to CAC ratio, and there's guidelines for what is healthy, what is not healthy. And you start to get into what does growth look like, churn if it's a sort of SaaS or a similar product, gross retention rate, net retention rate. All of these things kind of tell you, is a business healthy? Does it need a ton to kind of grow at any one time, or is the growth sort of organic? Where is the growth coming from? I think those ultimately, so I think all of these metrics, like these 4 or 5 levels, they collectively tell a story. And I think sometimes, I think we make the mistake of only focusing on one aspect of that, and really like look at it holistically, look at it organically, and kind of say, okay, this is where the business metrics are. Let's look at the product metrics. Okay, here's where the product metrics are. Maybe we can retire this feature over here, or we can get rid of this feature over there. That will save us some time and maybe, make the teams a bit faster because they don't have to maintain something. That will impact, sort of the team metrics. That will impact sort of the code level. So there's a relationship between the 4 or 5 levels for sure. And you see this, I think, very easily in SaaS B2B companies. Like, the faster the team moves and flows, you'll see more adoption in the product side, you'll see more sales, you'll see, so there's a push and pull for sure.
So generally it's all about resource management, time management, where to focus your efforts and attentions, and maybe where not to focus your time and attention. That's going to ultimately help the business. And
yeah, exactly. I would say maybe not like too much on time management. I think, in terms of like time management, I mean, certainly, please don't have teams do timesheets or time cards or anything like that. That would be horrible. But I think it's more like, for example, retrospectively. So for example, looking at maybe a quarter in hindsight and saying, hey, here's all the things we spent like 80% of our time on. Which of these made a dent? Which of these made any kind of impact or any kind of, how do they impact the outcome? Did any of them matter in terms of key results? And I think that's really healthy, but less like, sort of how people are spending their day, other than making sure people have, sort of uninterrupted, kind of flow-based time to keep their heads down and focus,
So is there any tools, or how do leaders actually, I guess, find these metrics or able to manage the metrics? Is it?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are definitely tools. There's I won't pick sort of any favorites, but there's definitely a host of tools. So on the code level and sort of quality and like some of the project management, Scrum based ones, a lot of tools that people use, everything from Jira, Clubhouse, other. Will do a lot of those sorts of metrics. In some cases, you may have to. I mean, it's certainly something that the last few years, we had to sort of do manually. Some teams, for example, will output a lot of their raw numbers into a basic, data warehouse like a Snowflake or something else, and then sort of create reports there. So again, if you want to be elegant, for sure, but Excel gets the job done as well. And so I think for the team metrics, that works really well. I think for other things, product metrics. This is really sort of, people have very sort of religious favorites. You have your mixed panels, you have, everything, the KISS, you have your amplitudes, you have, there's a whole host of metrics there. RJ metrics used to be another one. So there's a whole host of metrics there that will sort of get you that job. Really sort of product metrics, like how do you kind of create the funnels and engagement and reports and all of that. And then I think at the code level, there's a lot of tools that will plug into, I think, some of these either project management and or GitHub, Bitbucket, to look at some of those aspects as well. I think Linear. Let me just make sure I get the right name. I think Linear? Yeah, Linear B is one of them. There's a few others that sort of focus on like the delivery quality and the sort of pure raw engineering side of things, and I think ultimately then the job of the leader is to sort of look at all of these in context, because all of these things will tell you a specific insight. But metrics could either be leading, relevance, but also they could be leading or lagging, and so the question is, is it the cause of the behavior or the other way around, and so I think that's where you need the context and sort of experience, or working with peers or others to figure out what measure what matters, and then I think that's what I would do.
And again, do you think that's harder to do in a startup than it is a large business that maybe has more resources and tools, or is it more that it's not so much what you use, but it's just important that you are collecting this data and reporting this data and then using that data appropriately?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's probably easier in a large company, because if nothing else, you probably have someone to delegate it to, and that person can kind of run with it. At a startup, like I say, if again, kind of looking back at that quadrant, if you don't have a lot of process experience, or you don't have a lot of, then you may think, well, like why measure any of these metrics? And like it's clearly all sort of people.
Nothing to compare it.
Exactly. So I think in those cases, you probably are doing yourself and the teams a bit of a disservice, because there may be a lot of like underlying root causes that have various symptoms that sort of mushroom through the organization, and so that's where I think it's really helpful. So yes, it might be the easy thing to overlook. So even if it's not shared publicly, so I think sometimes a compromise could be this: even if it's not shared publicly, it's still something that you should track as a leader. So you then have the choice of, kind of broadcasting that or not. But even if you don't, it's a good way to know that a team is. not to know exactly that a team is high performing, because there's other ways you could probably look at that, but it's a good sort of rough ballpark indicator of like, okay, this is a healthy team, or here's where I need to invest some time. Like if something like deployment frequency is once in 2 weeks, then that gives you a great signal. It's like,
Right.
okay, that's something I can invest in. And but if you don't know, or if you just assume that like once a sprint is good enough, then you don't know to sort of improve that. So.
No, great stuff. I think you also as well, you touched on, I was speaking about startups and larger businesses again, but you touched on technical debt. And I can imagine, when it's, in a startup, there's something to manage and keep track of and be aware of. But in a larger business, I guess, how do you continue to, I guess, build new products while still identifying the gaps with existing products and whatnot? Have you noticed, how did you, I guess, deal with that in both startups and larger businesses when it comes to technical debt?
It's a great question. My experience of that is that it's while it's never easy, I think of late, like maybe like the last like 5, 7, 8 years or so, I think there's definitely a bit more of an appreciation within the startup side of technical debt, of what it means, because I think a few people. So I think that we have like a few people to thank for that, right? Like I think a lot of people have heard about the Ubers or the Slacks or the Twitters. Like I can tell you how many talks I've been to just from Twitter about like rewriting their stack, and I think it's like 2 or 3. And so like, I think the point is that they hear the larger companies are going through that, and you can say like, well, okay, maybe they have like tons of scale and that sort of, but sometimes you see this just purely within the mobile stack. Like they may start as native, go to some kind of hybrid tech, go back to, native or something else. And so like, that's just within one micro aspect of the stack. And so, so I think that's one thing, there's been a collective appreciation of things like that. I think the other is, I think more and more, startups either have, technical leadership or advisory or sort of board or other product presence that will sort of advise them of these things. And so I think the point being, in either case, large or small, like technical debt is inevitable. There's nothing, it is coming like Tuesday. The only question is, what do you do about it, and then how hard is it to get the buy-in to sort of move? And so I think at larger companies sometimes, and again, this is my experience, but it may be somewhat slow. It may take weeks, months, and probably not to be surprised if it takes like a business case, because you're going to ask for tons more people and like maybe new tooling, and so I've seen all of that happen. But I think that's only to underline the point that the platform or the product or the technology in question is that valuable. Like the whole point that so if anything, the technical debt is just larger. It's like the countdown in New York Times Square, right? It's just like the longer, the more customers kind of flash through it, the longer that the larger the debt sort of grows. It's just like that, and so it just makes it harder over time. So I think if anything, there you have a little bit of an advantage, because you can kind of explain, hey, look, this is something that like 3 million people or whatever your use case is, so many people depend on. If we don't, start working on this now, when we get to 4 million, we're going to sort of fall over, or we're going to have like X, Y, and Z outcome. So you can kind of make that impact. I think with a startup, it's a bit harder because, I think the, leadership always wants, everyone wants to get to the next level. Everyone wants to get to the next sort of growth indicator or growth stage. And so I think at some point, there's also the realization that some aspects of debt, not all, some may put a bit of a stop on that, or in terms of we got to move a bit slower, and no one wants to hear that. So I think in startups, the communication part and kind of mobilize quicker may be more difficult, because maybe not everyone has had like that level of exposure or heard about some of the larger tech startups going through this, or of some kind of technical boards to sort of advise them on things like that. So but I think that's where like your job is as a leader, to set those dots, and to say that this is the debt and it impacts this and this product or platform, and here are the stakeholders impacted, and this is either a mature product, or this is an immature one. This is a core functionality or a non-core. What is the impact? Does this impact internal users? Does this impact customers? Does this impact developers? That's something that people often don't take into account. If the impact is developer facing, people sort of gloss over it, and that's actually a huge mistake. So all of these are stakeholders and matter to an equal degree. And so I think that's where you really sort of have to put some kind of framework together and help make the case.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, especially within startups, technical debt is inevitable. But as a leader, it's a case of keeping track of it, prioritizing, and being aware of it. Do you ever find in startups that people maybe have the slight mentality of it might be somebody else's problem later down the line to deal with, rather than it be themselves? Or
yes, it's a great question. I don't know if it's that. If that's the case, I mean that's a little bit of a red flag, because then someone isn't sort of taking ownership. Maybe it's less that. I think it's usually it's with good intent. It's usually
I don't think anyone means to leave a mess, do they, in such a way?
They don't intend to leave a mess. I think it's hey, look, the business might say something like, hey, can you have this done by like such and such day? We kind of get to a few weeks before that, and you find like you're way behind. And then you have to make some hard choices, and then you have to sort of cut scope aggressively, and that's where like the debt happens, because now either there's like an expectation or something overbuilt or underbuilt into the product or the product behavior, or a bunch of technical decisions on the engineering side, like skipping on tests or skipping, which again, God forbid, but like these things happen. Or like maybe you skip a code review here and there, and like things like that sort of build, and then you cut some corners. And again, it's never with the intent of creating debt, but that's where sort of things happen. And you might point out something in someone's pull request that typically you might like them to sort of come back and fix, but the deadline is Monday or Tuesday, and you just sort of okay, fine, like we'll come back to it. Or there's like a standard for how you do something, and you kind of go outside the standard because it's quicker, and then you never sort of. So I've seen all of these sorts of things, and then you release, and then you have a sudden, either uptake or some other tangential force that pushes you in a different direction. So then the thing that you said you will come back to, you never do, but the business is moving forward, and you have to build on top of that. So so that's where, I mean, like I said, it's usually with good intent. And I actually say, like, I mean, just to go a step further, I actually welcome debt, because like you say, the only way to guarantee no technical debt is for the company to be out of business, because then you don't have to pay anything back, because there's no sort of creditor, So that is never desirable. And debt means that the business is growing, because the decisions that got you to a certain point have now taken on a new size and a new scope, and that's what everyone should want.
There's only debt-free progression, isn't there, in a way? That you can only leave debt from there being progression.
Exactly. So that's where the other strategies. It's purely within product engineering, just making sure that your heads of engineering, and it could be VP of engineering, directors, CTOs, whatever. Just have really close relationships with their product counterparts. If it's one organization, great. If it's two organizations, just the same. Where that technical roadmap is always interlaced with the product roadmap. It's never two different roads. It's always a sort of recipe for disaster. But there's one roadmap, and it's sort of like fingers sort of locking together. It just interlaces, and should be the goal for every technical leader, because then you're getting buy-in. You're explaining the impact. You're explaining the value, just like any other product feature. So that's the least that you have to do as a technical leader.
Oh, brilliant. I just wanted to finally touch on the actual hiring process then as well. So you've obviously been, a leader in both small teams, big teams, distributed teams, global teams. What sort of challenges have you sort of found? What advice could you give to people who are currently going through this process of trying to hire in, whether it be global teams or distributed teams? Anything on diversity as well? And I wanted to touch on that subject. What sort of advice would you give any leaders when it comes to hiring at the moment, especially with the current climate as well, I guess?
Right. No, great question.
There's probably a lot of questions there, to be fair, thrown into one.
It's a lot of questions. I will do them all. So, okay, a few things. Firstly, I think when it comes to diversity, I think the what I've seen over like the last how many ever years, like is it's really important. Two things. One, if diversity is important and it matters to you, well, first of all, it should matter to you as a leader. But my point is, it needs a sponsor. It needs someone who cares about it, who thinks about it, who invests in it, who measures it, who reports on it, makes those things public, because those don't happen on their own is my point. And so, it could be a technical leader, it could be a people leader, it could be, the executives, it doesn't matter who necessarily, but, I think it needs a sponsor or a backing in the sense like, this is important and we are going to, it could be a value of the company, but this is important and we are going to invest in this. And I think that is, sometimes like half the challenge, because it certainly doesn't fix itself on its own, which relates to the second point, which is, if you want to be a sort of modern, sensible tech team and or company, then you can never get started too soon on diversity. So, a few stories. I mean, when I've worked with like things like recruiters, and even, fairly recently, you'd be surprised. And this is in, 2019, 2020. I'm not saying, 2005 or 6. I mean, this is very recent. Even now, recruiters, if you work with them, will sometimes push back and will sometimes say, hey, I don't know about this diversity requirement. And I guarantee you, if it's not a world-class recruiter, will come back to you and say, well, if you impose a diversity requirement on us, that means we will be able to hire much slower. And are you okay with that? So almost putting it back on you, and rather than saying like, okay, but then here's what I need, or here's and I think this, I don't know how I feel about this, but like I've seen some recruiters say, they may charge a bit extra for, sort of diversity recruitment, right, which again, like strikes me as odd, but I think their point is like some of those things require a lot more lead time and a lot more investment. So, I mean, in that sense, maybe there's something to it, but anyway, my point being like, I think even recently
from a recruiter's point of view is just maybe there's just if you are looking specifically, for diversity, it's just a smaller pool of candidates. There's nothing more to it than that, which just means it just maybe limits the amount of people that we can put forward. But I don't know why you charge
and then I think it changes. Exactly. I saw a stat recently. I forget what the woman's name was, but she was presenting. I think it was like a CTO conference somewhere. But anyway, I don't know if the stat is accurate, and I can't share the source. But I think she had said something like 70 or 80% of, and this might be in the States, but 70 or 80% of female engineers are not at the senior level, or something like that, which means that, in order for not just diversity, but for recruiting to be successful, you need to have a fleshed out, career architecture and or a ladder and or strategy for your company, large or startup, so that you can, for example, if those metrics are accurate, then where to focus, like where to sort of really invest and create a program where maybe people can join as a junior to mid-level engineer, but then grow into a senior, and you can kind of help. Yeah. You can take the responsibility for help changing that metric if that's accurate. So that's one thing. Non-diversity topics. I mean, I think I've had the pleasure, and like I really do think it's a pleasure, because I visited all or most of these locations. Had the pleasure of building tech teams now in like 14 or 15 cities, around the world, not counting, distributed folks, just in their own location. So I think that the main point there is there are, good, great, and not so good, not so great engineers everywhere. I mean, no one has a monopoly on any of those things, So, I don't know if some of this is still accurate, but like, I also was able to see, certain locations. Like I think, for example, Europe has a lot more sort of open source type, folks, people who either contribute to it or, things like, PHP, LAMP. There's a lot of folks in that sort of mindset. There's a lot of, kind of JVM, Java, sort of between parts of Asia, parts of the US, a little bit in Europe, but maybe not as much. So you kind of see like a little bit of like variance in kind of distribution of, and again, this is all anecdotal. This is not published data, but so anyway, so my point there is take advantage of like global teams and distributed teams from the get-go, but be really specific with your leadership and with your immediate chain as to why you are doing so. Because what you don't want to do is get into the situation where you expect you expect sort of best of breed innovation centers or hubs and like really amazing dev locations, and really what your sort of business counterparts expect first and foremost are cost savings. And so
Right,
I think if there's a fundamental alignment on things like that, then that never works out.
For the
So I think
best
the important
talent rather than the cheapest talent is kind of
exactly. Like so for example, if you are a startup, you have to think about what tools do I have at my disposal that a large team doesn't, or a large company may not want to. And so, for example, that's where, like I said, the career ladders and sort of bands and everything else is really helpful. This is just within the States, or it could be within Europe, or sort of across the world. You could pay people like an 85th or 90th or higher percentile within local market, which probably no one else is doing there. So you kind of have buy-in and kind of brand loyalty and everything else from that. But then you are challenging them with really challenging, stimulating, high value work. And so that's, like I said, where the cost thing, I think when this first started, I think the notion was, well, folks elsewhere are cheaper, so like let's send the sort of grunt work, low value sorts of things. And I think there's a place for that, and some people do that, but for product development, for customer facing product development, high value kinds of things. So I think global teams, global distributed teams, and then like I said, your values will help. But then once you adopt that, really sort of embracing other best practices. I think FaceTime. A distributed team doesn't mean no FaceTime. If anything, it means high value FaceTime at certain points of the year, or points of the quarter, or maybe around planning, or year end budgeting, or whatever the company does. But so for example, when I did a lot of like distributed teams, like there was always like someone in the air. So someone's always flying to one of the offices, and one of the offices is always flying to one of the teams. So you always have someone. There's always like some FaceTime and some relationship being built. And you have a choice of do you go through a partner, do you go through some kind of vendor, and I think where possible try to, and it's not always feasible because of local limitations and accounting and whatnot, but where possible try to double brand people. And what that means is worst case they are employed by some local entity, which could be some kind of third party, kind of a pass through for billing and invoicing. So yeah, exactly. But as far as they are concerned, they work and live and sort of are a part of your company and your team, and so that's the double brand. And so then there's like a bit of loyalty. There's like you get amazing ideas. There's ownership. They really care about things. And some of these locations you get companies or engineers who have worked in embedded systems, in antivirus and security, in web apps and mobile. So you get incredibly well-rounded engineers, which you probably couldn't if you were just looking just in New York, or just in SF or something like that. So I think embrace global, embrace pay sort of handsomely or at a good percentile for local market. And then the rest of the time, really kind of build.
How do you identify, I guess, locations? Is it a case of where good universities are, or, is other good companies that work in that region, or how would a leader sort of identify where to maybe look to have distributed teams?
No, that's a great question. There used to, so it really depends on, worst case, like I think, if it's a smaller company, like let's say it's just like 3 or 4 people, and it's just we need to get a mobile app, or we like some kind of MVP, or we need to get funded or something like that. Then what you could do is there are services. I'll just mention a couple, but something like a Clutch, which will help identify sort of either agencies or individuals
Right,
or freelancers sort of everywhere, and it kind of vetted and rated it. You can kind of it's a bit of a roll the dice, but generally vetted,
good
and a lot of the
recommendations and stuff.
recommendations exactly help you with billing and everything else. So I think worst case, not worst case, but on one end of the spectrum, there's that. If it's a very large company, then chances are between like some kind of corporate function and sort of business teams, you probably have a mindset for where the business is going to be expanding. So that's always a good idea, is to have is part of giving back, but part of investing is if we're going to sort of enter the I'll just give an example. The Asian market is probably a good idea to have, sort of Asian presence in terms of technology and other things. So that's always a good strategy. For everything in between, I think I think it really depends on the current values and abilities of the team and where you would like to take them. So, for example, if the team is relatively less mature, and by that I mean handoffs aren't that clear, documentation isn't that good, deployment frequency isn't that often, all of these things. And by the way, these are all things that can change. It takes time. And what you don't want to do, what is very hard to do, again, not impossible, but very hard, is to try to change some of those things that I just mentioned, those metrics or abilities, the same time as you introduce a completely new presence or sort of hub and kind of collaboration point. But then what is the thing that you are trying to do? Are you trying to improve the underlying metrics or abilities? Are you trying to make this thing a success? Sometimes those conflict. And so that is, not recommended. But for everything else, really, if you take a rational look at where you are, those will tell you certain things. So, for example, if the team is relatively more mature, has a good written culture, so has a lot of written documentation, relies on like asynchronous type behavior, then you can really go distributed and really maybe have like a larger team. Maybe I've seen teams do it as far as Australia, if you're in the States, or Asia, or anywhere in between. Because maybe things like time zone or other things don't impact you as much. But on the other hand, if you're finding it challenging to collaborate within the team that you already have, then introducing some of those components might be more challenging.
Yeah,
exactly. So then maybe kind of staying. And so, like, for example, if you're in the States, you might have near shore, sort of Latin America, Canada, sort of types of presence. If you're in Europe, there's a huge and a very able and growing ability in the Middle East, in Egypt, in Africa. And so, those within a sort of, and then not to mention, Central and Eastern Europe, within a 1 to 2 hours or 3 hour time zone difference, which still gives you 4 to 6 hours core working hours.
So as a leader, before you, I guess, actually look into the idea of, distributed teams, you need to look at what you have currently. And if the platform is, as you say, mature enough to actually bring a whole new team, and it's going to have to leverage off the existing work that this team has already been doing.
Exactly.
Interesting. Well, no, I think there's been lots that I think people can take away from today. So thank you so much for your time, Vijay. Is there anything that's you're kind of passionate about at the moment, or anything that you want? Sorry, there's a fly in my face. Anything that you wanted to say before we go?
No, I mean, I think keep investing in the teams and keep investing in yourself. I mean, I think you are, as a leader, or as much of an individual as anyone else in the teams. I think you should keep focusing on your skill sets and growing those too. And otherwise, I think really figure out what your leadership model is. I think I hear that question a lot, and I have an answer and a methodology, but everyone needs to figure out what it is for themselves. And are you how do you like to work with the team? What does collaboration mean to you? I think kind of develop and harness and fine tune that over time.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much coming on, and I'll speak to you very soon.
Likewise, pleasure. Thanks.